really happy to present our speaker for our next podcast with Lectures Without Borders, who is Jessica Flore Angel, who is architect of spaces and communities and ecosystems, and with whom we will be talking about several different subjects today. I mean, first of all, I wanted to talk with her about her background, of course, because it's fascinating, and we are really happy that you agreed to share your experience with us. And also, of course, we wanted to talk about your experience of teaching this subject, which you are an expert in.
Thank you. I'm very honored that you thought of me. I think I will. I like to describe myself more as a amateur than an expert, but trying to gain more expertise with time. So yeah, indeed, I guess I'm an architect, designer, but also I try to think of the theories behind my discipline. And I like to say that I'm an architect of spaces and communities because I think during my studies, something that was always missing was the human component. And there was always, hours spent behind a computer looking at buildings, but I felt I was missing that kind of connection to who are the people going to live in this, we're going to live in the spaces, what are the programs. And I think often when you design, you obviously think of all of those things. So you're not only thinking of the building per se, but you're thinking of its context, the history of the place in which it gets built. You're thinking of how the people are going to inhabit it and how it's going to evolve over time. And so I guess in my recent project, which is a bit of a live project, the Chateau du Fay was for sale for 10 years. And right now I'm renovating it, but I'm also kind of running it as a space to create kind of unique experiences, but also to experiment with.
Tell us first where it is exactly located so that people who are listening to us from different countries, they know in which country you're working in.
It's in Burgundy. And so for the past 2 years, I've been living a bit of a schizophrenic life where my architecture practice is actually in New York, where I started a small practice with two friends from grad school. It's called Almost Studio. And that is more my work as a kind of standard architect, although we try to be as innovative as possible. But I would say it's more in the line of what you would expect someone who studied architecture to do. And then my kind of other project, which more and more is getting more prominent, is the Chateau du Fay project in Burgundy, where it's not only the renovation and creating the spaces, but it's also restoring biodiversity and also creating programs where people interact amongst themselves, but also with the space. And this project emerged after having spent a year working in the field of education. And I guess for me, the Chateau du Fay is a school, and it's just a different types of school than the kind of institutional, like the institutional ones. So maybe, I don't know, we can go back to that.
Yeah, it's very interesting because, so first of all, right, one of the main reasons we wanted to discuss with you was because you have this unique combination of skills in both an interest in education and the architecture components, which for me, it seems very, very unique experience because I'm from a different background, right, from mathematics. So could you tell us, please, more about how a person, right, who has been studying architecture, right, and you have been doing it in different countries, as far as I know, then afterwards got interested in the educational component, or maybe it's natural, maybe all architects are doing that. Could you tell more about this connection between education and architecture in your context? Why education then, and why you started this project maybe? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really deeply rooted in my persona. I think I always knew that at some point I would be kind of interested in pedagogy and education and really kind of communication, passing one information from one person to another. And I think it's John Dewey who always said that there is more than just a common etymology between communities and communication. It's really the humanity survives because knowledge gets passed from one generation to another. But the interesting thing is, I think I've always been kind of suspicious of the way that I was taught. And, you know, very early on when I was 15, I participated in a kind of European project where, you know, we would meet with other high schoolers and we would try to like think about how we taught ecology or language in our school systems. So, you know, thinking about that was always there. And it's very funny because I remember that when I first got to architecture school, I said this funny thing where I was like, one day I'll be like a dean or something like that. You know, I was just like, this is more the thing I'm interested in, actually, to learn the discipline in order to see how we can kind of teach it better. And that was always in the background. And I think the funny thing is that I'm not a institutionalized teacher, and I'm not sure I'm aspiring to be really, unless I'm given a blank canvas to do it in the way I want to do it. And that's why I'm kind of doing those alternative projects where I think learning really happens.
Yeah, perfect. So this actually is exactly linked to my next question, right after we kind of already are on the same page. We understand what we can actually learn from you. Can you tell us actually more about this, what you call alternative teaching, right? What it is for you? I mean, maybe it's hard to talk about it just in a few sentences, but if you would characterize it in few words, what does it mean for you, alternative teaching? Is it like teaching without marks, or is it teaching in nature? What it is for you, and what did you do for teaching architecture, or teaching what you have been doing in Indonesia? Maybe you could tell more.
Totally. So I think I feel I was extremely fortunate after 8 years of studies and internship, where, you know, I had been TA, I mean, teaching assistant or teaching fellow when I was in grad school, etc. I was really lucky to participate in a program called GACO that was started by a guy called Kenta Koga. And that gave me mental space literally for a year to reflect on those past 8 years. I guess even more, because it could start, you start going to school at the age of of 3, right? And it's like, and basically for all my life, those are the spaces where I had spent the most time. And so at the end of all of my studies, to be given the opportunity to really reflect on that for a full year was really amazing. And I think the key question was like, what makes a good teacher? And I was like obsessed, and I was like, okay, in the past like 20 years, who are the people who have the most influenced me? And you know, I kind of started having those kind of maps of characteristic, you know, empathy, curiosity, thoughtfulness, etc. And then the thing that Kenta used to say, and that I agree a lot, is that you know, there are 6 ways of asking questions in English. You know, what, why, where, how, you know, and so who. And so the problem is that education only focuses on the what. It's like, what did you learn to do? You know, what is this equation? And you know, we just forget that actually there are all of those other, you know, at what time did you learn the thing, and you know, and where was it, you know, and who did you talk to, and so all of those ingredients are so important, because you know, this is also how our memory works, right? If you make it, the more experiential you make it, the more kind of imaginative, and then you really remember the things, and there is that connection. And to spend like 8 hours in a classroom where it's just like back to back like things on the whiteboard and you're just taking notes is completely absurd, because it's not taking advantage of the experience design, you know, that you can create to actually transmit and give an idea. And also, I believe that you don't need to be an experienced teacher that is like 60 years old in order to just, you know, teach something to someone else. And as an architect, in the past 4 or 5 years, I've been really interested in communal living, and I've been really interested in those places of where actually communities meet and there's a lot of interaction and exchanges. And I think whether it's summer school, summer camps, communes, you know, military service, I mean, those are places where actually you're just putting a bunch of people with different interests in a box, and then they just like teach each other. And that kind of peer-to-peer learning, I think, is really, really important, and participates. And I think, you know, that kind of co-living component, you know, where you're in some way, you're kind of at some point in your life taking a similar path as someone else that's teaching you something, and you're walking along. And then, you know, just someone who kind of walks the path a bit before you, that's your teacher, is really, is to me a very powerful idea, because to me that's where I've learned the most. And I think often it's in the interstice, right? It's like you finish the class and then you have this like 5 minute chat after where actually it clicks, right? And you know, or you're gonna go see a movie, and then at dinner you discuss it, and then that's where it happens. So actually, giving that kind of spaciousness for more interactions before and after the class is very important. I still believe we should do, you know, lectures and workshops. That's sometimes it's the best format. We don't have to reinvent the entire wheel, but I think giving more, you know, kind of more attention to the different parameters is crucial, and especially for architecture, you know.
Yeah, so related to this, it's very interesting because I remember when the summer schools in mathematics, which I was participating, that was exactly the case, right? Because if you want to teach some hard science, right, hardcore science, either it is architecture or mathematics, you need to give people to think themselves. They will not learn how to prove theorems without giving them space between this time, right, when you give them information. But in terms of space where they are, because you are an architect of space also, right, and architect of communities, so could you explain maybe more or elaborate more about how the ideal summer school place could look like?
So yeah, and I guess it links to maybe Indonesia and what I did there. But so through GACO, this program called GACO, where I ended up working full time. But first I was kind of selected to be a senpai.
Could you
Senpai in Japanese.
What it is exactly? It's Japanese, right? Or
so it's a Japanese educational project that wanted to kind of bring those ideas and the idea of also of you know, liberal arts to it started first in Japan, where, you know, the education is pretty rigid, so it was kind of a counterbalance to that, and then it kind of expanded. And so the year I joined, it was the first year in Bali, and through the connection with John Hardy, we ran a summer camp at the Green School in Bali, and then the next year I came back again to Indonesia, and we organized a camp in the Bamboo Indah, which is the hotel that you know, where John Hardy lives, and you know, I led some architecture workshops, and I think one thing that I was trying to do is to obviously there were a bit of lectures and background, because at some point you just need to like communicate some framework. But then, you know, we played with like bamboo, and people made little models. They thought about their homes and shelters and things like that. And then we also had like a communal big building construction. And, you know, there are ways that you can do this in a very easy way. Like you use bamboos and rubber bands, and it goes really fast, and it's very experiential.
Yeah, and how was the summer camp itself? I mean, because for some summer camp, for example, which some of the lecturers without borders were doing in Indonesia also, in Sumatra, I think they were doing that in the forest because it was on forest preservation. And for that, it's clear to me how to make this summer school, right? You start in the classroom, you explain some theory, then you go to the forest. But for architecture summer school, is there anything particular, like you have a central place where everyone is gathered and then people are showing their work, and the rest is like a space where you create? What is the structure? Like, how could I imagine it if I would like to experience that without going there?
I think there are several components. So I think you have moments where it's kind of more lectures. Then you need some sort of space for discussion, but those can happen anywhere. You know, you just need a table or people sitting on the floor. And
Yeah.
then it's nice to have kind of a workshop area where people can draw or, you know, kind of make little models and things like that. And then I think what I think is fundamental and is missing a lot from my from architecture studies in general
Mhm.
is some sort of piece of land or forest or anything like where you can build together. And you know, it's absurd that you know, in architecture studies we don't do more collaborative projects because potentially it's a bit the same in science, I imagine, you know, where and I think across disciplines is that it takes you know, it takes 100 people sometimes to make a building, right? From like, you know, the stonemasons to the lead engineer to the, and you know, we spend our lives in in school of like having you know, projects that are done alone most of the time. Awards are just, you know, granted to one person and not a group of people. You know, when, you know, actually there are like teams of people behind projects in real life, and so I think we just really need to get much better. And same with the kind of interdisciplinary, right? Because as an architect, you not only work with like engineers and you know, like the classic ones that sometimes they try to connect you to in schools, but you also, you know, work with clients with different backgrounds, and you
Yeah.
know, you have to also be in charge of the marketing, and you have blah blah blah, you know. And so it's all of those different things, you know, and knowing how to work with different personalities, all of those human values that you need to acquire, that you kind of just learn on the field. But it would be nice to kind of be a bit more intentional about getting better at them before
Yeah.
you
Yeah, it's really
practice
great
them.
that you talk about this collaborative component, because usually indeed the classical way is usually indeed kind of more that I'm a teacher and I'm teaching people right in the classroom, and there is no collaboration between, or it's hard, right, to make it collaborative, because how then you will evaluate it? But then afterwards, if you talk about this peer-to-peer more, and in Berlin, for example, we were coming to schools with lectures without borders, where there were no teachers in classroom, right? So it works like this: you enter school, and then there are a lot of open classrooms without doors, and then you see there children who are gathered together in circles, and they're solving some problems there. I mean, themselves basically trying to solve some problems. I was very inspired, but I know that probably it's very hard to manage it. So, for example, could you explain or give an example of any collaborative project? I mean, we will put links to your website, of course, so that people can also look into this amazing bamboo constructions you were talking about. But what could be example of the collaborative project for children or students to learn the architecture? Would it be construct a house, or
Hmm.
what could be a,
Yeah, it's I wish I had more things on my website, because there are a lot of things I've done that I didn't really document, or because it was like not really nice to see, you know. It's almost like you write about the thing, you know, the kind of build project at the end does not really matter as much as the process
yeah,
to get there. And so one of the, actually it was interesting, so we had a summer school at the Chateau du Fait, actually. So the first year after I acquired it, like then, you know, the 6 months later we had like a summer camp there. And by the end, we read Heidegger, you know, building, thinking, dwelling, and you know, there was a group of like, actually I think it was, no, all, it was like 5 girls and a boy, so we were like 6 people with like 3 senpai, so teachers, and so it was like this little group, and then, you know, we just like kind of could design, and we're like, okay, we need a space to do the final ceremony for the camp. So we're like, okay, it's nice, we have to like do a final ceremony because it's the closing. What are we gonna do? We're like, okay, it has to be a bit original. And so I was like, listen guys, one of the most important thing in architecture is to find a good site. So, you know, just for like almost a day, the one thing was to find like the right place in the forest, and we're just like scouting. And then we found this like crazy hole that was already kind of carved, and we're like, that's it. And then we spent 3 days just like you know, some people were more like heavy lifters and stuff, so they made the stairs and they like dug even deeper, and some people were like more into you know, making little nice things so everybody would get like their necklace. And you know, I think there are things like that, you know. And later in life, I started organizing this art festival, which is multidisciplinary, you know, 9 disciplines from art, architecture, performance, gastronomy, etc. And what I noticed is that almost for me, it was less important to do a good festival. It ended up being really cool, but like it was to empower also my friends in those kind of collaborative projects. And what is fascinating is, you know, I gathered people. I was like, okay, now there's a castle. You guys are all coming from different disciplines. Like, what should we do? And it led to a festival. And there, because it's a free project, because people are just doing what they want to do, you just end up naturally finding your way, right? And instead of putting kids with like orientation people that are like, so, okay, you like art, you like science, maybe you should do this. Sometimes just to be like, okay, we're organizing a big feast, you know, everybody has to co-create it. And then people are naturally going to kind of take on the task that they feel comfortable with. And something as, you know, insipid or like just, I guess, banal as like a communal dinner can already, you know, and you're like, we have to make everything from scratch. So someone is going to be interested in maybe do the plates, and someone is going to be interested in like giving the intro speech, and so more like theater. Maybe you, if you want to introduce some science, you can be like, okay, we need to measure the tablecloth, so we have like a golden ratio. Like you can play with that, you know, and then you can kind of put some constraints so it becomes more difficult. But those are, to me, the experiences that are really project based and allow people to think holistically about what it takes to actually make a project happen. And in real life, that's what happens, right? You have a destination, and then you're just going to learn along the way, you know. And there's a school I love in San Francisco called Brightworks, which is linked to the Tinkering School. They do those kind of like summer programs, and I love like the year I kind of visited the school, they had this 1-year curriculum called By Land, by Sea, and by Air. It's also to empower girls to build things, right? That's one of their mission. And so, for instance, by sea, you have, you know, a phase of exploration where you're going to ask a lot of experts on like, okay, how do you build a boat? And then, you know, like, then you're going to use math to construct the boat to go on the water, and then you're going to build it. So it's using your kind of curiosity, your ability to research things and find information. In a world where we have internet, we don't need to learn by heart things anymore. We just need to become good at finding the informations. I mean, some stuff you learn by heart, but you know, it's also important to know where to find the informations. I love learning things by heart. I'm dating a memory grandmaster, so but the
so it's a topic of the next podcast, I think. Knowing the memory, the knowledge about these alternative schools, right, which you mentioned, it's extremely important, because as you mentioned that now you can find basically almost everything, but because there is so much information sometimes in the internet, it's hard to get to this point when you will be able to find, okay, I want to learn architecture, right? Where can I learn that from, right? I will get most probably to the website or somewhere where Google will lead me, which will be completely classical, right? Or it will be, I mean, Science 4, or like, it will be very, very, like, you know, non-alternative in a way, and maybe not the most profitable for your inspiration and for your creativity. So, for example, for you, when you were learning that more in the beginning, which books or like people, professors inspired you the most? Because when you were mentioning this schools you're organizing and festivals and summer camps, you mentioned some names, but if you could tell more, exactly what were your what could you recommend for people who want to teach or to learn, right, architecture? What could it be?
So, yeah. So I guess I'm a big fan. One of the projects that you know is obviously something that I hold dear in my heart is the experiments done by Black Mountain College, which is a project that lasted for 30 years. And you know, where people like John Cage, you know, got out of the school, and so it's and there were a bunch of, it was very kind of Bauhaus inspired in terms of teaching, but people lived together in the place and they built things, and it was very interdisciplinary. The school was actually built by, you know, the few students that wanted to create the school. And so I think it's the type of projects where everything is kind of intertwined. And I think that creates really kind of deep and meaningful experiences, that kind of bubble, the idea of a liminal space, right, where you arrive, and because you're a bit cut from your normal institutions, you have the space to rethink frameworks. And so I think that leads to a lot of creativity, because often people, we have to realize that like most people never get out of the institution, you know, their institution of the family, the institution of the school, and they go from one institution to another. And so being able to go to those spaces that extract you a bit from your normal world, where you can kind of put your preconceived ideas on the side and really have the ability to experiment is great. So that's one, that's more kind of on education and the arts and architecture, and obviously there was some science. And, you know, a lot of those artists used, you know, people like Buckminster Fuller, they are typically architects who have, you know, use science and social science and kind of combine all of those things. Then you know, one of my best mentors were just great teachers. So I was lucky at a time when after I finished my undergrad, I ended up in a terrible internship in Berlin, and literally I was almost kind of not. I didn't want to drop architecture. That would be too big of a word. But I had lost a lot of my interest and my early passion, which is crazy. Like, how can you? That's what people does you. It's not even that it's like stays like that. Some people just like make you disgusted by something you used to be passionate about, which is like crazy to me. And I ended up at an internship at Peter Eisenman. And Peter Eisenman is a great figure, who's been one of the best educators of architecture in the 20th century. And it was amazing because like I worked there, and then he would spend like an hour per day chatting to me. The best thing I learned was not like to draw stupid things on AutoCAD, although I was drawing pretty cool things. I was drawing like Palladian villas, etc., for his book, and we did like a project at the Venice Biennale. But like the best part was just that like he would drop books on my table, you know, things like that. You know, and because I was like a good intern, I like would read them all. You know, this is such a gift, you know, like if each teacher, for instance, before summer, you know, gives a book to each student because they know a bit the student, and they, you know, like building a bit that personal relationship. But everything we're talking about is really luxury, you know. It's, you know, then we're, you know, entering a bigger political discussion, which is like, you know, teachers should be the highest paid people. You know, like it's not normal that they are really unpaid, that, you know, it's like 30 people jammed in one classroom like crazy, you know. It's like all of that makes it really hard on the teachers, you know.
When you are asked to explain to someone architecture from scratch, and you know that the person, you don't know the background of a person, what are those, for example, 3 points of the knowledge maybe which the people should know or should be aware of in order to actually be able to say that they are studying architecture? Is it history, or is it geometry, or maybe it's art, maybe it's cooking, right? I mean, what are those pillars which are for you, right? Architecture is very interdisciplinary, for me at least.
Yeah, it's a paradox. So architecture is kind of at the intersection of a lot of disciplines, but architecture is actually about architecture, and it's a discipline on its own. So it's always the paradox where it's like, if you're only doing art, science, and social science, you'll never get to architecture, because architecture is actually a thing on its own, but it has components of science and arts and social science. But I think first is to learn how to look. I mean, this is first and foremost. This is a way to see the world. And when you're teaching, you're kind of trying as much as possible to take your eye and give it to someone and see like, okay, this is how I see the world. And so I think that's kind of the gesture of a teacher. And ideally you do that with as much passion and enthusiasm as possible, because then they're excited to look into your eyes. And so learning, for me, that was the best thing when I started architecture, is like all of a sudden you're seeing the world with a finer grain, right? Like you're kind of, you're kind of sitting in the living room talking to your friends, and all of a sudden you're noticing the tiles and you're noticing the beams, and then you're looking at the walls and you're like, oh cool, how is this, and so you're never bored, because all of a sudden you have all those things that now you understand, or basically that now you're paying attention to, right? So I think that's the key word. And so it's learning how to pay attention. And so observing, meaning like visiting buildings, sitting in them. It's very similar to someone that would teach about landscape, for instance, or gardening. Like first and foremost, you just look at the flowers, and you look at the trees, and so here I would say that's the most important one, learning how to look. And then there are ways to do that, by kind of trying to draw, trying to memorize, trying to feel, touching. You can kind of use all of your senses. It's not only look with the eyes, it's also kind of experience as much as possible what is space. Then I would say the second thing is to, once you've done that and get like maybe a more intuitive feel, it's to obviously read and learn. So I think learning about the history is crucial, because if you want to do something different, you got to know what's been done before, right? And it would be really silly if you were to do something and then you realize someone else has done exactly the same thing. So kind of, almost laying down your what you think is an original thought, and then kind of then spending time to just research and read to see that they're sometimes not that original, or maybe you're thinking about them in an original way, and so pointing out what you see and what you don't see in the history. And then the third one, which is a bit tough, because like you can't really teach people how to design, but because it's kind of, everybody has their own way of designing, and obviously you have methodology and things like that. But I think something you learn is to, by training and doing it hours and hours of kind of imagining projects, you become a bit better, or not being afraid of the white canvas. So in order to do that, you whether keep producing, so that sometimes helps. You produce, and at some point something appears. You learn how to have a community of peers that you can talk to, being like, oh, I'm lost, but this is the thing, and then they kind of brainstorm with you. So you have all those kind of techniques to kind of progress. So those are the things I would kind of focus on. But obviously then you can have interest. Some people are geeks about construction, and some more about the arts, and some more about theory. That's it's good that some people specialize.
Yeah, no, but indeed my question was more general, and I think that you gave so many directions already. So for me, I think one question which I wanted kind of to slowly come to the end of the discussions for today is actually a question which we usually ask for all scientists, artists, architects with whom we discuss with Lectures Without Borders. And it's a question which is related to interactions as teaching or lecturing in different countries, right? In different countries, and you have been working in different countries, right? The way of teaching is very different. And especially in Lectures Without Borders, which is for lecturing by traveling scientists, right? Like I am from Russia, I will go to teach in Mongolia. Teaching is very different. So are there any examples or insights which you personally had when you were teaching in different, or you were studying, right? Or learning architecture in different places? Or
it's tricky. I mean, I would say when English is the common language, it already helps a lot. So because it means that people have already kind of learned a common language. I think what is important, and I've been teaching in classes where there are 40 kids and almost everybody comes from a different place. So I think, is how do you use the diversity as a strength. So for instance, in the workshop that I called shelter, make your own shelter, people had to kind of describe their homes through a little space, or their ideal home. It was like your ideal home, but also where you come from. And so in some ways you're kind of magnifying and making beautiful the fact that people are coming from those different backgrounds. Then I think is really creating this meta space. I think something that I really felt disappointed with in my undergrad is that there was no meta discussion on what we were like, on how we were taught, you know. So it was like, cool, this is what architecture is, and I'm like, oh, but weird, I like this type of architecture. No, this is bad, this is how we do it here. And it wasn't even this is how we do it here, it was like, this is what you should do. And I was like, wait a second, you're biased. And they were like, no, we're not biased, you know. Well, I think having had a meta discussion on like, okay, cool, those people are biased, this is the stance they're having, and it's okay, but at least we're discussing you know, their pedagogical stance on the discipline they are teaching. And so, which means it's nice to actually include the students in the discussion of like, I'm coming from this place, this is how I've been, you know, taking like even half an hour or an hour, you know, out of like all the time being like, this is how I'm used to teach, this is what we do, where I come from, are there different styles here, are things that you like, you know, like actually bringing on the people on discussing the format. And see, and you know, sometimes people have like really cool ideas, and maybe you can have like a free card at some point where there's an hour where like the student just literally picks how he wants to arrange the classroom, how he wants to, like, you know, and giving a lot of ownership.
Wow, this is good insight. Actually, nobody before you mentioned ever this, because we were mostly coming to mentioning that we all should be on the same page. So a lecturer, right, a person who is traveling and giving a lecture should know the background of people, but more than just a background, you need to know cultural background and what maybe is important. So like being on the same this page after meta discussions you mentioned, it's really great insight. Thanks a lot, Jessica, for discussing, for insights. And we will also put the links under the podcast when we will put it to your resources, so that everything what you mentioned or you feel important to say, we could share with our colleagues around the globe. So thanks a lot for being with us.
Great, thank you.